Apologies for the long title, so let's not spend too much time on that title. There are 4 or 5 things that I'd like to do. First, I would like to talk a little bit about the changing role of science in society, and that we live in unusual times where there is no single truth, and given that there's so much confusion, it's been mentioned by Ines already, misinformation is the word she used. It is a question, it poses a question for educators. How do we deal with these types of issues? Whether it's food security, lack thereof, inequity, loss of biodiversity, or climate change. These are all rather complicated, even wicked issues. And teaching about them is almost impossible. You need to engage people in them. So we live in unusual times, and what does that mean for science? Then the question about efficiency has been mentioned a lot, optimization of the current systems that we have, but on the other side also all these transition movements, trying to do things not just better, but trying to do better things, which is it's a different question. Some trends and counter trends in higher education that you probably will recognize, and then I have an education background, and I'd look at learning and the philosophy underlying teaching and learning. And I've done this in an agricultural university, Wageningen, for a long time. So I have that as a backdrop. But I'm kind of looking ahead to the future. What might the future look like? What might the 21st century, which we're already in quite a bit, become in terms of our arenas for teaching and learning? And I call that creating vital coalitions and learning ecologies. Okay, here are just a few questions to illustrate the point of ill-definedness and confusion and ambiguity. This question, and I asked these questions for different audiences, and you get different responses. I mean, the first one: are genetically modified foods inevitable to feed the world? If you think yes, then raise your hand. If you're not so sure but you think probably yes, then raise your hand. Okay, now how many of you would say no? We can feed the world without GMOs. It's just a matter of doing things differently. Okay, there's some of those here too. I'm not going to answer that question, obviously. But all these questions, human-caused climate change, is it a fact? I know that things are now shifting. It seems all across the board that indeed this is happening, but we all know the other IPCC report, very controversial, and only because maybe a small percentage of scientists countered the findings, also using scientific evidence, and that 1% probably got more than 90% of the media attention, which makes the public wonder, if scientists don't know, then why should I have solar, or why should I drive electric, or why should I change my life? And if the scientific community doesn't really know what's going on and what should be done, then, give me a call when you do know, and I'll do something. That could lead to inaction and apathy and powerlessness, and as a result, people may not change at all. And this is a risk, of course, when there is uncertainty and doubt. This is, we talk a lot about urban agriculture, the rise of organics, but you could ask questions about that too. Are vegetables grown in cities healthy, for instance? And is organic sustainable? There may be examples of organic that are not so sustainable. If we start moving it all across the world, if we import organic mangoes from Burkina Faso in the Netherlands, might be organic, but is it sustainable? This is a complex issue. Soy milk healthier than cow milk? Is it more sustainable? And I put one in there because I realized there are many men of over 50 here. I thought, should men over 50 be tested for prostate cancer? In health, it's the same kind of issue. 5 years ago, the answer would be yes. You should get tested. Today, the American Medical Society recommends that you do not get tested for prostate cancer. Why is that? Because if you do get tested and they do find cancer, you will be treated as a cancer patient, and you will, in all likelihood, become incontinent and impotent. You'll lose the cancer, but you've gained something else, which isn't so pleasant. Whereas the chance of that cancer becoming full-blown cancer before you're 80 is very small, so it's better not to know. But maybe next week there will be a new test that will show if you have this type of cancer, then it could become aggressive very soon, and you should be tested every year. So these insights change all the time. And that means that the teaching and learning and educating about these issues is rather complicated. What do you tell students? What do you tell the public? I was in Rio at Rio Plus 20 a few years ago already, and the green economy was the big item, and a lot of people were rallying, especially Europe, behind the green economy, green skills, green jobs, which was in some ways a turning point in that in Rio in '92 it was hard to get the world of business on the table. In Rio Plus 20 the world of business was very much joining the conversation. And the green economy, some were really excited about this green economy because it would maybe make our economy more sustainable, but there were others from other parts of the world who were actually concerned about the green economy being hijacked by certain companies that can certify products and have the mechanism and means to do that and have the finances to do that, whereas some smallholder farmers maybe do not have those possibilities, and therefore it's kind of a neo-colonial invention. Interesting to see these contradictions. A lot of misinformation is mentioned. This is about strawberries. I'm not going to talk about it much, but you can see how complicated things are. In the United States, I was just reading on the plane over here in the International Herald, actually International New York Times nowadays, that there's a new way of labeling food, and there's 3 labels: good, better, and best. And the organic labels that have fought for a long time to get recognized, like in places like Whole Foods that have a lot of organic foods, they were kind of upset about it because these new labels, they also include like energy efficiency, and they look at other factors also determining the quality of a product and not just organics, which may confuse things, but it also leads to a whole new debate about labeling again. Myths and facts about organics. I mean, we could look at many of these things. The wind turbines that people are promoting nowadays, and solar as a resource that is renewable. How about the metals that are in the magnets of the turbines? Those are rare earth metals. A lot of them are in China, and maybe that leads to geopolitical problems, or maybe we'll run out of them someday. So these are all complex issues, and especially it becomes even more complex when this doubt that there is created. It becomes very political. Interesting book, Merchants of Doubt. In a paper in The Guardian, an article about doubt over climate change as a product with an industry behind it. An industry that believes that they have an interest in maintaining the system as it is and not changing it, not transitioning to something else. That's not in their best interest, but doubt will keep people from changing. So it's manufactured doubt, much of this. True or not? I don't know. Could analyze it. This, of course, has been mentioned this morning. Talk about 2050, 9 billion people. We basically need to produce 2 times more. It needs to be 2 times healthier, and we need to use 2 times less resources. And the food needs to be accessible for all as well. This is a tremendous challenge, and our agricultural universities are right at the core of meeting this challenge. Agriculture or life science universities, the question of how do we attract students is of course one that we have seen also in say Western Europe, in the Netherlands too, where in 1998 Wageningen University almost disappeared. And today we have doubled student numbers, which is interesting. Why are young people so interested in Wageningen now? In part it's because of rebranding to life science, it's also because a lot of young people are concerned about these questions. They may not frame them as agricultural questions, but they may frame them as sustainability questions or food security and nutrition and health questions, and then they are very interested. And the technology side's definitely one of the attractions to that. So how do we do that? The two kinds of options, from incremental optimization at the technological end as well as at the societal end, or a transition where we actually start questioning some of the principles and some of the foundations um, of our systems. And that might look like this if you start taking it from, say, a food security and food and nutrition security perspective. And you could even debate whether these examples are in the right spot. Metropolitan agriculture can be done in a very high-tech way, vertical agriculture, for instance, with lots of, I mean, in Holland we talk about pig flats near cities or in cities even. So it could be very high-tech, but it also requires a transition in the way people think about food, more localized food, green spaces in cities, urban agriculture. It changes relationships between people and places. So you could say that's a transition, both societal and technological, but also a shift in protein, meat-less diets or insect-based diets, things like that. They require a major transition in people's thinking and culture of foods, although in some parts of the world more than in other parts of the world. So this is another choice. And it's probably not either or, it's probably both as usual. But we need to think both in terms of transitions and in terms of optimization, and not just optimization. That's the key point, I think. The sustainable food pyramid, we see lots of FAO, the more narrow approaches as well as the more integrated approaches, where we also look at food sovereignty, fair and just food, where food ethics become important as well, where it's just more than availability, utilization and access, where we also consider the nutrition and the enjoyment side of food, which we often tend to forget in these discussions. What does food mean in people's lives in terms of quality of life, and in terms of social connections with each other? If we only eat food at the table with a smartphone and we don't connect anymore with each other either, then maybe food is losing that function, which some may find acceptable, it's just the way it is, and others might find it highly problematic. It's again a discussion we should have. Rob Gibson has this nice typology, oversimplified of course, between simple, complex and wicked problems, where he argues that problems like climate change, food and nutrition security, biodiversity loss are wicked in the sense that they resist defining. Every time we think we know how they fit together, what we need to do, what the causalities are, then something will shift. The knowledge will change. And it might be different in the context too. What might be sustainable food and nutrition in Kampala, Uganda, may be something else from in Wageningen in the Netherlands. And what we may find sustainable today may turn out to be unsustainable tomorrow. Many examples of that. And that makes it different, the role of science in society. How do we deal with ambiguity, chaos, complexity, and how do we engage our students meaningfully in these types of questions? Because they are urgent. We're all agreeing on that, or more and more agreeing on that. Now, this slide came a little too late because the phone just went off. But cell phones, access to internet, of course, Wi-Fi. I always find it ironic when a meeting like this starts that the first information provided is the password to the Wi-Fi, which is an excuse immediately to leave the room. If we had a red light on our head which should go on at the moment we would go away, meaning check our mail or check something else, then it would be a very interesting picture. Why do we do this? You could say it leads to a lot of connections with people all over the world, which change our life in that way. Um, and also in poor parts of the world, people may not have clean drinking water. We didn't succeed in getting people clean drinking water by the year 2000, which was a millennium goal in 1950. Still 1 billion people without clean drinking water. But we do have cell phones in the poorest parts of the world, whether it's in Burundi or Colombia or in Vietnam. People have cell phones. Of course, poor people's, for poor people, a relative big portion of the income goes to the phone compared to with rich people. So it takes a big chunk out of their livelihood possibilities. It also gives them benefits, access to markets, data about weather, when to plant, when to go to the market, etc. So there are advantages. But overall, if you look at the equation, the net gain of that, we need to wonder the access to information and the exponential growth of information that our students have access to as well. They too go to Google and Wikipedia for answers, and there are questions to which you can find the answers on Google and Wikipedia, answers that we as teachers used to provide. But we now can wonder, is that our role still? If the technology is there, is that our role? Or do we need to find a new role in this digitalized information age? And as E.O. Wilson says so powerfully, we are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. Some trends and counter-trends in higher education. My university very much a focus in the last 10 years on science for impact. And then mainly impact factors in journals. A lot of peer-reviewed journals, and we talk in terms of, it was mentioned earlier that, that measurement can be good things, but in some cases management by measurement can be a bad thing too. I've seen that in our university we have a culture of accountability where everything is being measured and people make sure that they get their points, but there is no time to engage meaningfully in debate because you don't get points for debate. There's no points for reviewing papers, you only get points for publishing papers. I'll get to that in a minute. Counter-trend is science for society, where we see that if public money is going to be spent on universities, then the public should benefit from the university. Otherwise, why would government sponsor universities? So there needs to be the societal relevance, and we see some examples of that. Oh, go too fast. A lot of focus on increasing efficiency, but counter-trend, authentic learning, citizen science, engaging people in real issues in the community. Science as commodity, where students are seen as clients, as input, throughput, output, where we get our money based on the number of diplomas that we deliver, a number of PhDs, where it's almost a commodity, where the rankings are like a stock exchange, where we go up and down, and we need to go up and we need to grow. If we don't grow, something is wrong with us, which is another interesting observation. We talk about sustainable growth and sustaining growth, but there are plenty of places in my university where I think we should talk about sustainable contraction, doing more with less, maybe even doing less, focusing more on quality, not on growth. Then we talk about transitioner. It's a transition kind of statement. Questioning continuous growth. Maybe that's contradictory to the whole notion of sustainability. To sustain is to keep on going, to keep the same in a way. Sustainable development in some ways can be seen as a contradiction of terms. Maybe sustainability as an alternative to development. That would be an interesting discussion. Just to illustrate this, because it's a non-scientific graph, I must warn you immediately. But if you look at the number of scientists worldwide, then in my part of the world it's relatively steady in Northern and Western Europe, and maybe in the US as well, and Canada. But overall it's growing a little bit because in Africa and Asia there's a growth of people working in universities. So there's a slight increase in scientists worldwide. The number of publications they write together is exponentially growing. But if you look at the time to read, or to review those papers, it's going dramatically down. So the bottom line is everybody's writing for nobody. Now you could say, but people are getting cited, so there must be, people, citations, we look at that too. And H factors, what's your H factor? That's a popular question in Wageningen. But these citations do not necessarily mean that the paper has actually been read. So Science for Society, counter-trend, the Dutch accreditation organization, Dutch-Flemish I must say, VSNU, looks at societal relevance more than they did before. It's one of the criteria that they use to judge the quality of the university. I already talked about the increase in higher education in terms of student enrollment and growth, and many people getting diplomas, but we may end up in the future with what we would call a diploma-less society, where people do lots of courses, they do lots of MOOCs, they collect a lot of certificates, they have lots of experiences, earlier obtained qualifications, and when there's a job, they need to perform something or do something to show that they are capable. And then maybe when they kind of crowdsource for workers, and they pick the best, and maybe when they leave the door after the final interview, there might be the question, where did you study, or did you get a diploma? It may become a less and less relevant question in the future. We can discuss this as well. The MOOC hype, beyond the MOOC hype, MOOCs are kind of presented nowadays as the solution to these growing numbers, very efficient way of teaching and learning, but does it lead to more wisdom? That's another question. So we need to also look at MOOCs in a very critical way. So here then is the challenge, I think, for educators. I've been using this slide for a long time now. It's a very simple slide. But our young people today, our students today, they obviously will be having to deal with these kinds of issues more than we do even. Because it's likely that many of these issues will accelerate in the coming years, climate change just being one of them. But are we preparing them well to deal with these kinds of issues? So if we look at higher education as a counter-trend as a commodity to more a community, then we look at more blended arrangements where different kinds of areas of expertise come together, and organizing that, brokering that, co-creation of knowledge between different societal actors, that could become a key task for our universities in the future. And it's already the case, I think, in many universities that are even in this room. These are just some examples of working from the outside in. It's not all new. Maybe what is new is the digital technology that can be used to do this type of work. Things like drones and smartphones and sensors connected to smartphones and apps that can help investigate, explore change in the community, change in nutrient intake, change in CO2 emissions, change in all these things, biodiversity, local biodiversity, measuring that, documenting it, using GIS systems. This is bringing a lot of young people to our field. So we're shifting from this Cartesian view of learning, where we all, the traditional teaching, like teaching photosynthesis or Newton's laws, where there is some kind of correct way of representing it on an exam, and the teacher tries to do his or her best to convey photosynthesis, and on the exam the students have to kind of hand it back to the teacher. And if you hand it back in the exact same way it was given to you, you have the highest mark. But the problem is you often give it, literally you give it back, because a few weeks later you don't remember. So we're shifting from this Cartesian view of learning to a more social view of learning that requires participation, interaction, meaningful engagement, and the question is with the social media and the Facebook type of engagement, if that's a meaningful way or if it's just zapping from one place to another without ever going in depth. Um, a lot of our education is becoming edutainment. It has to be educational, it has to be entertaining, because otherwise people may get bored. And boredom is something that's not allowed, even though I think boredom is an essential part of life. You cannot all the time be entertained. So this kind of a picture suggests a shift towards from this more reductionist, deterministic way of looking at the world that we have very much developed quite well in higher education, and that is the basis for much of our technological successes, including our smartphones. That type of thinking, which will remain essential, needs to be complemented with a more integrated, holistic perspective. That requires utilization of diversity. Dissonance that gets created when people come together who aren't like-minded, but create that confusion and ambiguity, discussing it, that is what leads to learning. That leads to a reframing of what we know. So the power of diversity, creating better groups in our systems, linking school and society become quite important. Not just the critical thinking was mentioned by Ines as well. I think it's very important that in climate change, as you probably know, there's a lot of emphasis on adaptive capacity. People need to adapt to the changing climate as if it is inevitable, which in some ways it is. But at the same time, we need to start interrogating the systems underneath climate change. That requires disruptive capacity. And disruptive capacity is something else, and we don't hear much about that. So I have just 2 or 3 more minutes, I think. But in Holland we talk about the Dutch diamond, and it's not really Dutch, it's universal, I think, where we try to connect these 5 corners in our education and in our research and in our governance. You see that many governance programs are trying to co-create, I call it sustainability for the moment, you could call it something else, sustainable food and nutrition security, could be another way. Linking research, education, governance, private sector and societal organizations. They all bring their own knowledge, they all bring their own experience. And organizing this, brokering this, might become facilitating this, is one of the new tasks, I think, of 21st century educators. And if you look at food and food security more holistically, and you look at the different perspectives, whether it's reducing post-harvest losses, post-consumer losses, nutrition and health, access, availability, all the peripheral systems that are part of it, soil, biodiversity, local development, all the processes that can help shape this, capacity building, research, governance, chain management, entrepreneurship, education, then you start looking at food security, in this case, more holistically. And we need people who can do that, which, in Wageningen we talk about the T-shaped skills, where the vertical T is kind of the specialization that you probably need some in-depth knowledge about something, but the horizontal T, the bar of the T, is the kind of outward orientation that you need in order to understand whole systems and to speak different languages so that you can communicate with the world of business or with NGOs or with the world of governance or people from other disciplines. So 21st century skills or education in some ways requires looking at the content of the curriculum, new emerging issues, ideas, cradle to cradle, sustainable intensification, or sustainable contraction, or both, alternative development, resilience, using drones and new technologies. Where is that in our curriculum? We need to look at that. We need to look at new forms of research, phronesis, reflexive praxis, citizen science, recognizing that it's not just scientific knowledge, but also local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and how to bridge those, how to bring them together in a good way. Linking with society as a whole, I already showed you the Dutch diamond, world of business, multi-stakeholder environments, looking at societal impact, not just impact factors and journals, Place-based institutional practices, our universities often do not model what we talk about. If you look at the food in the canteen of Wageningen University or the way we design our campus, I think a lot can be gained from the knowledge that we have in our own university in designing the campus itself and in the food that we eat, or the energy that we use, or the waste that we create. Somehow we separate that world completely. We have all the knowledge in-house, and then we have some kind of process where we go external to find people who can design it for us. But it could be a wonderful laboratory for experimentation. New forms of pedagogy, new forms of teaching and learning are inevitable. It may look like this in a very cartoonesque way, where we start integrating what we do in our institution with the immediate outside world. This is an example of primary and secondary schools working along this way. And there are many schools beginning to do this. Okay, my last slide is the Ecology of Learning, which talks about recognizing that we have different filters, different values that we bring to education, that we need to think about the different languages, the technologies that we use, how we embed them in our teaching and learning. It's not just learning about knowledge driven, it's not just learning to do, it's also learning to be and learning to make change, to shape the world in yourself and around you. And it's not just data, information and knowledge, but also meaning, understanding, and ultimately wisdom. Blending formal, informal and non-formal learning. Peer-to-peer learning, mastership and apprenticeship learning, intergenerational learning. That will be more of the future. These sustainabilities that we talk about, you can find in the paper that is in the document. But what are these sustainabilities? Works nicely in English, it doesn't work in other languages. But these are some of these dimensions that we need to start cultivating through our higher education. You can find this in the paper. The full paper is in the binder, in your pack. So these are the key points. We need to create more space for systems thinking, integrative design, and multiple ways of knowing. We don't do much of that in our universities. New competencies will be needed, not just on the part of the students, also on the part of the teachers and the administrators. We need to blur the boundaries between institutional, community-based, workplace learning. And critical thinking, questioning taken for granted values, behaviors and systems, utilizing diversity, asking those difficult questions, having these counter-hegemonic perspectives, we need to consider if we are to be the highest of all educations, which we claim to be. So, and sustainability, which is kind of my main driver in my current work, can become a catalyst of innovation and in research and education with people and planet in mind. Thank you.